but we're gonna stop it. So here we go. Welcome. I'm so glad you all are here, and I want to invite you, please, if you're not speaking, to stay on mute, but you are welcome to turn on your camera if you would like to. It's obviously not required, but we'd love to see your faces if you want to share your face. So glad that you're here, and I want to introduce a special welcome to Representative Marvin Lim and Representative Viola Davis. I'm going to give them the opportunity to introduce themselves, but I do want to say a few words about them. First, Representative Davis was one of, I interviewed a number of legislators before I started, after I'd won my election, and Representative Davis was one of the people who took time out of her schedule. I think you maybe talked to me for like an hour and a half. I mean, you told me everything, all the things, and just was so wonderful about helping me to get prepared to do this work as best you could. And so Representative Davis, thank you so much for that. And why don't you introduce yourself, and then I'll say a few words about Marvin and he can introduce him. So go ahead, Representative Davis.
Yeah, I want to make sure you can hear me. I'm Representative Viola Davis, and I serve Georgia House District 87, located in DeKalb County, primarily in Tucker and Stone Mountain. I serve on 4 committees that include insurance, the interstate cooperation, natural resources and environment, science and technology. Just to give you a quick overview about me, and I love to serve the people because it's their votes that hire and fire me. It is their tax money that pay me. And as such, I refer to the taxpayers and voters as my employers.
Well, thank you so much, Representative Davis. I'm so very grateful to share a portion of your district within my district. And then we have also Representative Marvin Lim. Marvin and I were campaigning together at the same time, and I actually had the wonderful opportunity to meet you via Zoom. I think that's when we started. By the time we were all campaigning together, it was via Zoom, but Marvin has been absolutely a wonderful person. I think, Marvin, did you introduce like 32 pieces of legislation? Is that right?
34.
34. Oh, that was too short.
Price is Right rules, you win.
So just incredibly smart and talented and thoughtful. One of the things that really impressed me on the campaign trail with Marvin was just how much he cared about the citizens of Gwinnett, which is a part of the area where he serves, and particularly about people whose first language may not be English, and for those who are living on the margins. And so he and I share that in common, and I'm really grateful for his mind around money and taxes and all those things, and thinking really creatively about how we can provide some relief for those who are living close to poverty or in poverty. So thank you, Marvin, and I invite you to introduce yourself.
Yes, hello everybody. I am Marvin Lim, or Representative Marvin Lim. I still have to get used to saying that. I'm originally from the Philippines, moved to Atlanta, the DeKalb side of Tucker, when I was 7 years old. Attorney by profession, primarily civil rights, and I represent House District 99, which is all in Gwinnett, and it's primarily unincorporated Norcross, Lilburn, and the unincorporated Gwinnett side of Tucker, which does exist. And it is a district that's very diverse, over 85% minorities and over 50% immigrants, foreign-born immigrants like myself, primarily from various South American countries and Mexico, lots of Southeast Asian countries, and a not insignificant population of immigrants from Africa. So I love that diversity. And it's also, as Senator Jackson mentioned, there also has some challenges. It's a district where this was before COVID-19, about a quarter of the people, not just households, the people are at or below federal poverty levels, and over 40% of people don't have health insurance. You can imagine that COVID-19 has exacerbated that. And, being an immigrant and growing up on public assistance myself, something I have great empathy for, and I'm always trying to represent the citizens of this district, particularly because on the flip side of things, you can also imagine we have to work a lot to engage them. That was true in 2020. It'll be true in 2022 and beyond. So very honored to be here.
Well, thank you. And then the last person I want to introduce, hopefully you all know me. I am your Senator, Senator Kim Jackson, representing all the places that many of you all live. And some of you don't live in my district, but Representative Davis and Representative Lim's districts are within Senate District 41. And so that's why I'm here. But I want to introduce our actual host for today, which is my Chief of Staff, Chief Elizabeth Wilkes. She'll really be moderating this conversation so that I can just be a regular old legislator. So Elizabeth, take it away.
Hey, y'all, thanks so much for being here. Really excited we can make this work tonight. I know a few of y'all were going to join us actually back during session. We had this scheduled for that Thursday, March 25th, I believe was the date. And that ended up being a very intense and long and significant day, really for the history of the legislature. It's one of those days. I remember telling Senator Jackson, I don't think you could make this up in a book, in a story. It was such an intense time. And we had the two extreme moments of highs and lows with Senator Jackson's bill passing to protect victims of stalking at the same time that SB 202, which ultimately became the omnibus voter suppression bill, was also rammed through the legislature in a really hectic and questionable way, to say the least. So yeah, we unfortunately had to cancel as Senator Jackson was still in session at the time this was previously scheduled for. So now, a few weeks later, you know, we're happy to be here and kind of a little bit of distance, a little bit of time to reflect and really share with you all what happened, not only on that day, but also through Sine Die, which is the Georgia way to say the last day of session. And really want to be here to take your questions. A few of you all filled out our link to submit questions in advance. And thank you so much for doing that. Feel free to type your questions in the chat throughout the evening. Again, we'll be monitoring that as we continue to go along. And before we get into some of those pre-submitted questions, we also asked what topics you want to hear about. There's so many different topics that and areas that legislation in the General Assembly covers. And the top three issues y'all submitted are: number one, voting bills; number two, criminal justice reform and police reform; and number three, education. So starting from the top with voting, Representative Davis, would you like to kick us off talking about how voter legislation was a theme of this session?
Yes. Needless to say, the Senate Bill 202 was one of those bills that, of course, voter suppression bill, that we all basically took a caucus position on in the House to say that we did not agree with that legislation. Me being a veteran and also being raised by a Vietnam vet, my whole family into the military, you would not think that we would have to have a day that we would have to come back and have to fight for the right to vote. When it comes to House Bill 202, I mean, there's a number of things that are a problem. It shortens the federal runoff period from 9 weeks to 4. It decreases the number of ballot boxes, especially here in DeKalb County. We normally had over 30 ballot boxes, but now it gets to drop down to 5 when we have so many, a population of over 500,000 people. I mean, really, it restricts the time that voters can request and return an absentee application. It requires a voter to have an identification, photo identification, which some argue that puts you at risk of having some form of identity fraud by having to have that. It eliminates the hours that we can use to drop boxes. I mean, we can have a long array of problems, I mean, with this piece of legislation. I think the thing that bothered me the most was the fact that they can take over our local election boards. I know that there are 2 election boards that are going to be at the top of the list. and that is Fulton and DeKalb County. I'll stop there and give someone else a chance to answer on the voting rights bill. Go right ahead.
Marvin, do you want to add something?
Yes, Representative Davis covered most of it. The one thing I did want to add, which has gotten a little bit less attention, was very important because this is a full-on assault. And one of the ways that wasn't in the bill that we saw throughout the session happen and particularly impacted Gwinnett was various efforts for various local county delegations to reform their county boards of election. And they did it in ways that were clearly very partisan to essentially give the county commissioners the power to appoint the boards of election. Now, it's interesting because we in Gwinnett, which again, Senator Jackson is part of that delegation, we also tried to do it pretty much in the exact same way. But you may also know that Gwinnett is now controlled on the 5 seats of the commission by all Democrats. And that was such a heartbreaking moment to see that piece of local legislation on the House side fail. And it was purely for partisan reasons. And local legislation, we generally defer to the localities to do it. So we saw us on the House side, and certainly Gwinnett delegation, we mostly voted for those other local bills. And then when this exact bill came about on the Gwinnett side, because it was going to or perceived to give Democrats power, we were doing it in a bipartisan way. That it failed, I think speaks so much to the partisanship at work. And I did want to emphasize that because again, it was to Representative Davis's point about what they're trying to do with SB 202 is allowing for takeover of local elections board. This was another very blatant way that they attempted to usurp local control, particularly from Gwinnett, in a very partisan way.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add is just a little bit of why do these issues matter? Why do we call this voter suppression? So we say you now have to have an ID in order to request an absentee ballot. Many people polled by the AJC, whether they were Democrats or Republicans, were like, of course you have to have an ID. But what we know is that there are over 200,000 people in Georgia who don't have IDs. Many of those people are poor. They're brown and black folks. They're older people. So, you know, Mary Margaret Oliver, Representative Oliver likes to give this example of her 91-year-old mother who no longer drove, her passport had expired, had no reason to get an ID except she wanted to vote for her daughter. You know, so there are many people in the state, across the state, who don't have IDs. And it's not actually that easy to get an ID. If you want to get an ID, you have to have all kinds of documentation, namely a birth certificate. So imagine if you were born in 1925, do you know where your birth certificate is? In fact, you may not have received a birth certificate if you were born in 1925. You probably didn't get one until you went to get a Social Security card. So finding those kinds of documents can be really difficult. And if you were born in a place like Texas, the costs associated with getting that can be astronomical. So it is an additional burden. And that's one of the reasons why we talk about it as a problem. Shortening the federal period for voting. So why are we upset about that? Well, we went from 9 weeks to 4 weeks. And what we know is that in those 9 weeks between November of 2021 or 2020 and January of 2021, we registered people to vote. Children became adults in that 9-week period. People went from being 17 to 18 in that 9-week period, thus allowing them to be able to vote in that runoff. We have Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock today as our state senators, in part because of that long run-up. And so I know a lot of people say, well, we don't want all of those commercials and all the mail, and it's just dragging on and on and on. Well, by delaying it, by expanding it to 9 weeks, we expanded the franchise, right? We had 18-year-olds who got to vote for the very first time. because we had that long runoff. We had other people who maybe they missed the vote, right? They didn't vote or they weren't engaged, and we had more people who could vote. And so that long lead up time, while it can be annoying to some of us, it helps expand the franchise. And so that's some of the reasons why we call it voter suppression, and why we're troubled by it. So I just wanted to try to round that out a little bit as we go along. Elizabeth?
Yes, thank you so much for that. And if you wouldn't mind continuing into our next topic, criminal justice reform. I know this is an issue you're extremely passionate about, and would love for you to start sharing on the Senate side what you saw as the most important updates regarding criminal justice reform this year.
Great. So I think that the singular most important bill that we passed as it relates to criminal justice reform was SB 105, which actually does not get a lot of talk. So I'm going to let the representatives, you all can talk about repealing citizens' arrests, because that's important. But SB 105 changed how we do probation, and it actually paves a pathway, allows a pathway for thousands of Georgia citizens to get off probation. Many of you may not be aware, but Georgia has the longest sentences for probation of anywhere else in the nation. The average time period for a person to be on probation outside of Georgia is around 5 years. In Georgia, it's 8 years. I know people who are on probation for 80 years, 8 with a 0. 80 years. We have absurdly long probation sentences. And so what SB 105 does, and it will be law, which is really exciting, is that it says that if you've paid your restitution, and if you've been on probation for 3 years and you haven't had any trouble, no problems, right? You've checked in with your person when you're supposed to, you've paid your restitution, you haven't had any problems in those 3 years, then your probation sentence will be ended. It will be suspended, and you get to be free. And I think that is, there's a lot of people, y'all can talk about some other bills, but I think that the fact that there are thousands of people who will get to be off of probation, who will get off paper, is by far the most important piece of criminal justice legislation that we passed kind of quietly under the radar. And one of the reasons, the last thing I'll say about it is, one of the reasons I think that it was quiet and under the radar is because it also gives people the franchise. Folks who were on probation indefinitely could not vote. But once they're off probation, they're no longer on paper, those folks will be able to have access to the ballot. And so I think that's why we did it kind of quietly and under the radar. But I'm very, very proud and very happy that SB 105 came through. Do y'all want to talk about citizens repeal? I feel like that was in y'all's wheelhouse. It was a House bill, so.
Sure, I can talk about that. So that was obviously one of the pieces of criminal justice reform that got the most attention, and it did originate in the House. And the bill, obviously, forgive me, I'm forgetting the number. I can look it up right quickly, but it obviously repeals the citizens arrest provision here in Georgia. That was certainly inspired by what happened, the tragedy from last February 2020 with Ahmaud Arbery, near in Brunswick, Georgia. So that was something that was very positive to see, because it was, for me, very surprising, because it was an effort that, having been a criminal justice advocate myself, those were one of the things that has been on the list for folks like us who are advocating for reform for many, many years. And it was very good to see, if surprising, that moment could actually, that tragedy could actually be used for good. Of course, I always have to say that is but one thing, because at the same time, part of what happened with that tragedy was also the use of stand your ground. And I remember the sponsor of the bill distinctly trying to distinguish stand your ground from citizens arrest. We are repealing citizens arrest. We are not repealing stand your ground. People retain XYZ rights. And more broadly speaking, we know we have a lot of work to do with criminal justice reform. Obviously, being a member of the AAPI community, with what happened in March 16th, And, with the Democratic caucus of APIs introducing, various pieces of legislation, which I won't get into the specifics of, but all that is to say, we know that we have a lot of work to ensure that law enforcement and the criminal justice system, both of those as a whole, are not disproportionately impacting BIPOC people, are more culturally accessible, more language accessible, et cetera. So yes, citizen's arrest was a big deal, certainly, and it did originate in the House, but there's a lot of work obviously still left to be done.
Well, I'll go ahead and add to that. The House bill number was 479. In 2019, 2020, when the tragedy happened with Ahmaud Arbery, we went down and protested during that time. And at that time, we did a Justice for All package. And I'm happy to say that the repeal of citizen arrest was one of the items in that package that we wanted to change. It was about 12 different bills that we are still striving. I think we completed about 2. So we're still working to do a lot of the criminal justice reform, but let's face it, a lot of the reform has to start with us being able to take control of the House and the Senate.
That's right. Yeah, thank you for that, Representative Davis. And the last topic, if Senator Jackson, if you could just share a couple of highlights on education this year. Wasn't as major of an issue, but definitely still always such an important one. I know one of your campaign points was, hey, we need to fully fund education. And I think we're still striving toward that forever. Hopefully there'll be an end date on that eventually. But is there anything else you want to point out about education this session?
Yeah, so we did have the big budget did restore some funding back to education. So when COVID hit, and Representative Davis was there. She was the only one among us who was there. When COVID hit, there were major cuts that were done to the budget, and the educational budget took a hit there too. Now, what my Republican colleagues will tell you, and this may or may not be true, but what they will tell you is that we restored the education budget up to a point that when you add the CARES money, when you add the federal government money, because our school boards are receiving money from the federal government, that when you add all that money together, that they've fully funded education. That's what my Republican colleagues will do. Now, I think they're doing some fancy math. And I also think that we need to actually say, Georgia, the budget, our actual budget is going to fully fund education. And we did not do that. So for me, that's disappointing. And I think that every school district could have used an extra bump as opposed to just being brought up to level, which has never actually been enough. And we didn't do that. Another piece around education. So sometimes some of the work that we have to do in education is beat back bad bills. And I think we did that successfully as it relates to bills that were really targeted at trans children. There were a number of them that originated from the House that would have had major impact on how children who are trans experience their school life, and particularly when it comes to sports. And so we were able to beat that back, and I'm really glad about that. We also, unfortunately, did not beat back some of the bills around vouchers. So I've received a lot of questions actually since I voted on, there was a special needs, there was a bill that would allow for children with special needs to go to take some money from the state and go to a private school. And I've gotten a lot of questions about, like, why did you vote against that? Well, here's the thing. When you take a child who has special needs, so that what this bill did is it expanded the definition of special needs. So a lot of kids suddenly, basically, if you were a kid whose parent has resources who can take you to a doctor who can say that you have ADD, you can get out. Like, I mean, it's the standard, the threshold for special needs was expanded very broadly. But more importantly, when you take your child out of a public school and you receive that voucher for them to go to a private school, you sign documentation where you give your child's rights up. When you're in a public school and you have special needs, we have a mandate. We are required to provide accommodations for your child. That is what public schools must do. Now, we don't do it right, and we don't always do it well, right? And there are misses, but it is a fundamental right that you have. If you send your child to public school and they have an IEP, they have special needs, that we provide those for you. But when you take a voucher to a private school, you sign away your child's rights to have those accommodations. And that private school has no obligation whatsoever to accommodate your child's learning disabilities and your learning needs. And so that's why I voted against it, in part because I think that we need to make sure that these children maintain access to the accommodations that they need. And then secondarily, and this is really important, we aren't fully funding our public schools already, and these vouchers take money away from our public schools. And so for those of you who've asked that question, I hope that's a little more clear about why I voted against children with special needs. That's kind of how it was framed, when in fact I was voting for children with special needs and wanting to make sure that they could receive the accommodations and have the rights that they are entitled to in a public school.
Thank you so much for that explanation, Senator Jackson. Representative Lim or Davis, do you have anything else you'd like to add on education?
I will go next and point out the fact that this year our legislative agenda was HEAL, H-E-A-L, with H being health, E being education, A being accountability, and L being liberty. When it comes to the education, we removed close to $1 billion, just under $1 billion in the 2019-2020 legislative session as far as the budget. Now this year, they replaced about 600 million or so, but we still underfunded QBE by over $393 million. So when you go back, one of the things we did this year, we did legislation so that we can do physical notes to find out, exactly how much money we could save or in certain areas. The legislation that I did dealt with corporate welfare. If you look at corporate welfare and how much we left out of education, you would find that it would have probably been better to fully finance QBE than to give away the corporate welfare that we did. And I guess I can go over that later on. But we have to do a better job of financing education here in Georgia, because we have underfunded education pretty much over 10 years, totaling over $10 billion. And that has to change.
And I will add only a couple of things. One, with respect to the special needs scholarship, what I did was I was trying to think of it practically, because I think all of us on this call are certainly for fair and full education for everyone, and particularly those that might have more challenges than others. So what I particularly did was, okay, looking at special needs people in my already low resource area, where actually would they go? Where would they be able to afford to go with the money they would get from the special needs scholarship? And I found that most of that money would be spent not on any tuition, but because the money could be used on more than tuition, but on transportation. And I think that speaks to the poor infrastructure we have. As a corollary to that, I actually made a budget request for my district, and it was all about education, because all of my schools in my district are Title I schools. And a big chunk of that, the largest chunk of that request, was for transportation, because my local high school has said we need transportation not only for schools, but because so many people in this district, so many of the students work to support their families. They wanted just more public transportation. Well, that request was denied. None of my budget requests for my Title I schools was granted. And I think that just again shows why something might seem good, but you have to look at the larger picture, the larger context. That's why it's so important to fully fund public schools and not just focus on one thing. And the second thing I will mention as the positive, one thing that the Democrats did do, particularly Representative Sandra Scott, she was able to successfully push her policy to have in-state tuition for children of foster care and those who have experienced homelessness. So they'll be able to get in-state tuition. She successfully lobbied for that to be tacked onto a bill. So that is a great positive. We should celebrate. We as Democrats certainly celebrate when we get those. So I did want to do a special shout out for that on the positive end of things.
And she had tried to pass that bill for over 7 years.
That's amazing. Yes, that's a congratulations to us all, because again, when there's a win in the legislature, it's a win for all Georgians. So yeah, and also that's just a lesson for us all too. Things happen so quickly when the folks in power really want them to happen. Like SB 202 was rammed through both chambers in a single day. And yet good legislation like that of Representative Scott took 7 years, as Representative Davis just pointed out, to get through. So that's the kind of challenges that our legislators are dealing with all the time. Let's get into questions that y'all submitted to us. For a couple of pre-submitted questions first, I saw one come in the chat as well. Folks are interested in redistricting and reapportionment. And now that the traditional session is over as of March 31st, we're all anticipating a session later this year for the specific purpose of redistricting and reapportionment. So Senator Jackson, do you want to kick us off on just a brief overview of what that means? And then we can kind of get into a couple more details.
Yeah, so high level, and by that I mean 101, intro to redistricting and reapportionment. They're two different words and they actually have two different meanings. Reapportionment is the changing of the portions of districts, House districts that we have on the federal level. So in the United States Congress, there are 435 seats. Those seats are divided based on population, which we did a census count, right? Evenly across the country. So, if New York gets bigger, which it did, then it might get another seat, and West Virginia lost a seat consequently. California also lost a seat, interestingly. So it kind of swells. We reapportion those seats, spread those seats out across the nation based on the census numbers that we have. So we just found out that Georgia did not pick up any more seats in the House. We are 14. We're going to be 14 districts. That's what we are. Okay. Now, redistricting is the thing that I think really touches home for all of us, and it's the changing of the lines for where you get represented and about who ends up representing you. So it's if you look at the map of my district, it's what made my district my map. It's how we redistrict, and that redistricting is supposed to be based on making sure that you have the same amount of people in my district that a senator in Savannah has, that the senator in North Georgia has, right? So what it has meant in the past, and this will still be true. So my district consists of mostly DeKalb County and a portion of Gwinnett County. Senator Freddie Sims, who serves down in Southwest Georgia, she has 14 counties. In order to get enough people, right, to match what I have, she has 14 counties. I have 1.2, right? So that's what we're going to see. It looks like it's going to be about 200,000 people per Senate district, and we'll figure out where those 200,000 people come. Now, there's some nuances, and I'd love Viola and Marvin, if you would like to speak to some of the nuances to this issue, I'd certainly welcome that. But that's kind of the high level. Reapportionment, that's how many Congress people we have. Redistricting is where the maps are.
Yes, and Representatives Lim and Davis, please continue to expand on this topic. I'll point out that a couple of folks are also curious about how they can get involved. If this is a process that voters can engage in, and if so, what is the best way, most effective way to do so? And how are y'all involved in this process? So if you can speak to that as well as any more details, that would be great.
Well, to tell you the truth, this is the first time that all of us are going to be going through this process. I took the oath in 2019, so I didn't have a chance to have the full history of how this all works. But prior to being an elected official, I was very much for fair districts, in that I thought that there should be an nonpartisan commission to draw the lines. And I can tell you, I would probably be in the minority when it comes to having that, believing that that's the way it should be so that it'd be more balanced. But if you look at my district itself, you could see what the meaning of gerrymandering mean, and that all my district is in DeKalb County. However, I go north all the way up to some Atlanta addresses, and I go south all the way to Lithonia. And the way it's shaped is awkward. So I'm hoping that we can do a better job of the manner in which we draw lines. And I'm also hoping that one day we can have a law that would make it a little more uniform and balanced and nonpartisan.
Yes, absolutely. For me, I want to emphasize a couple of points. One is, this is why redistricting is so important. So you can have the most voter access possible. You can have the best candidates. You can have all the hours in the world to vote, no voter ID requirements. But if you're redistricted in a way where communities of color, communities of interest are packed in with people that think very differently from them, then yes, your vote still technically matters, but it becomes very difficult, if not theoretically impossible or practically impossible for you, despite all of the voter access, to be able to get your candidate of choice. So that's why redistricting is such an important part of a voting rights discussion. And of course, this is the year for that. And for me, it's interesting because I flash back to 10 years. I'm an attorney, have done voting rights cases, and I'm very aware of my particular district. It looks very compact, which is normally very good. But that's because this was the product of what's called packing gerrymandering. What they were attempting to do was to carve out communities of interest, largely Latinx, Hispanic voters from a district to my west, to dilute their power over there and pack all of them into this particular district. So my own district is a product of what can be done, sort of the nefarious ways to dilute the power. So the corollary to that, how you can get involved, a few different ways. One, there are organizations certainly that are following this, from the ACLU to an organization called Fair Districts. If you want to specifically be involved in redistricting to that level, I would encourage you to reach out to them. Regardless, if not, I think it's important to just keep up with your legislators and also raise awareness with others in your community, because that's the kind of thing that becomes important when the lines are redrawn and it goes to litigation, because inevitably it'll go to litigation. Then we can make the argument, no, you're carving through communities of interest that are communities, like literal communities. So they might not, although they certainly can and have, cut through one like HOA community or something like that. But we know the communities are broader than that. In my own community, again, there's lots of immigrant from various places, and that itself is arguably a community. But you can easily see them cutting through that if more people in this district aren't involved in the process, don't know what's going on. Because the more you are involved in the process, let other people know in your community, the more we are able to argue, this is a community of interest, this is a community of concern. By law, by constitutional and statutory law, they cannot be carved out. This is unconstitutional gerrymandering. So that's how I would urge folks to remain, to continue to be involved. It's going to be a very important process.
Absolutely. It's of crucial importance. Thank you for that overview. Let's go to a question that was sent in the chat a little bit earlier by Ms. Rita. There was some movement on increasing the number of Medicaid-based now and comp waivers. Was the number approved 250? What can be done in the next session to fund more? Maybe raise the tobacco tax by $1 to fund the waivers needed for the over 6,000 people waiting. Senator Jackson, would you like to speak to this a little bit?
I can. I'm also willing to let the others start if they like.
Okay.
Does anybody else want to speak to it?
Sure, I can at least start us.
Okay, great.
So yes, there has been that movement. And if you talk to sort of the experts, because obviously the money side of it is as important as pushing this as important and necessary policy. Most folks, say folks at Georgia Budget and Policy Institute, would point in exactly to the tobacco tax being raised to start to cover more individuals. It's been interesting in the session because when we talk about healthcare, obviously COVID is going on. We are Democrats. You raise these points about any discussion about healthcare must talk about Medicaid expansion. So you'll have those on the other side of the aisle kind of downplaying that, so that they will make the argument, just as they do in education, that that's fully funded. They'll make the argument, well, our Medicaid expansion covers so many more people. We know that it doesn't. We know that it particularly in COVID times, that's been very, very important for more people to be covered. And more broadly than that, I did also want to say, I think part of what's important about our healthcare discussions, including with Medicaid, is what we've seen during the pandemic, where there are sort of resources that you don't necessarily need insurance for that, but people are still having a tough time getting access to the testing sites, getting access to the vaccines, putting aside any stigma around that, people are having a tough time getting that. So I think a lot of what we can do moving forward within and outside of the Medicaid expansion is pushing for an administrative and more broadly a healthcare system that really serves those people that continue to fall on those gaps, whether that's the financial gap because they don't fall within that threshold to qualify, but also again the information gap, because again there are so many people that might qualify for certain things we've seen during COVID-19, but have had a great and difficult time accessing that. So I did want to make that point. But yeah, to answer the question, I think the tobacco tax would be a good part of that. Another part of that would be sort of eliminating some of the tax breaks we get for donations to things like the special needs scholarship, school vouchers. So there's a school voucher side, but there's the donation sides to those kind of qualified expenses, or rather scholarship programs. So that would be another way that you could start to fund this, is by taking that away from that side of things.
I'll go ahead and add to that one of the reasons that that I submitted a legislation to find out the physical note about corporate welfare was to show that there is money available to properly expand Medicaid. We have had 9 to 10 hospitals closed right here in Georgia in rural counties. So, and we're spending more money to insure less people, approximately just over 200,000, where we could be insuring over 500,000 people. But if you look at the corporate welfare, the services and programs are primary for the state of Georgia, are primarily relies on income assessed to both the people and the corporations. That's about 53%. And then the sales tax makes up about 26%. But what people don't understand is, just to give you an example, we pay about 476 million in tax savings, different types of tax credits, from job tax credit, quality job tax credits, all of that adding up to 476 million. But what people don't know is 81% of that 476 million go to benefit businesses and taxpayers based out of the state of Georgia. See, that is money that could be used to help expand Medicaid. Do we want to expand Medicaid, or do we want to make sure the people outside of Georgia get the benefit of over 476 million? That's something that we need to think about.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add about particularly the Medicaid base now and comp waivers, and those, just for people who may not know what those waivers are, they are specifically for people who are living with special needs, and it allows them to be able to actually stay in place. So oftentimes when we talk about elders, we talk about people being able to age in place. These waivers will allow people who have special needs to live in place, to live in their neighborhoods, to live in their communities by providing some additional resources so that they can stay in place. There is a waiting list of over 6,000 people who need these waivers so that they can stay in their communities. And there has been a movement. I think we lack a bipartisan desire to do that. And I hope that we can create that. It's not that we don't have enough money. It's that it's not a priority. And that's something that we're going to have to push. There is enough money, even if we don't raise the tobacco tax, which is ridiculous that we don't. We have the lowest tobacco tax in the whole, in the entire country.
Yes.
We could definitely raise that tobacco tax. But even if we didn't, we have the money to fully fund these waiver programs, but we don't have the will. And so that is the work of the people, is to inspire and call out and urge the will of my Republican colleagues, especially, to get on board to fully fund these waivers.
Absolutely. Representative Davis, I recall right before our previously scheduled town hall, you hosted a COVID town hall specifically to provide some key updates to folks on that. And it's just one of those things. I mean, we're over a year into this pandemic, and it's still, we have to talk about it because it's still raging on, as much as all these other issues are as well. And so if you wouldn't mind, would you provide an update on the latest with COVID-19 to folks on the call?
Well, to tell you the truth, we're getting ready to hit our 1-year anniversary. We're doing an anniversary show tomorrow. I'm part of the COVID-19 response team of the Georgia House Democratic Caucus. And for over a year, we would submit information dealing with the number of COVID cases for adults. We were some of the first to broadcast the number of COVID tests amongst children, and also the number of our elderly that were coming up positive, especially in it being a crisis situation when they were in the elderly homes. We would talk about the number of people being positive in the elderly home, especially those staff members, which made it really difficult to care for the patients. We would come on at least twice a week, giving people updates like the disparity in vaccinations. Right now, 61% of the vaccination goes to white people, whereas people of color are getting approximately 26 to 29%. So we're trying to see what it is we can do to increase that disparity in vaccination. Some are saying that it's because when it comes to COVID, people are hesitant to get the vaccinations. But when you weigh what can happen to you as far as being intubated, if you come up positive, we're hoping that people can see it. You have to make that decision with your doctors if you going to take the vaccination or not. But I can tell you now, I personally, being a critical care nurse, had with a number of allergies, went ahead and had both of mine, and with hardly any side effects whatsoever, other than this like sore arm. When it comes to COVID, we are moving into a time where we need to stay abreast of everything, wear our masks, social distance, and when you go out, when you come back in, make sure you wash your hands for the 20 seconds. You need to do everything you can, especially with there being variant types of the COVID now. So we need to be extremely careful. And I would say so for a number of our elderly that are grandparents, what we found that a number of the cross-contamination of your younger people bringing it home to your elderly. So we need to be extremely careful as far as COVID on that end. Anyone else want to add anything?
I have to add only that you're absolutely, the disparities continue to exist. I mentioned the diversity in my community, and I have a lot of people that come to me with reservations about vaccine. And you can also see where, again, going back to testing, where the testing was done, where the vaccine sites are done, that there are definitely disparities, not only in who's getting it, but where they are being served. Because to go back to what I said earlier about transportation being a barrier to education, that's also, among other things, a barrier to, getting these critical healthcare, getting this critical healthcare. So I did want to add that, again, from coming from the perspective of a particularly diverse place, that what Representative Davis is saying is very, very true. And I think we need to keep, when we talk about how we reach diverse populations, we've only recently just succeeded, for example, in getting Department of Public Health to publish some of their information in Spanish, which is the second most frequently spoken language other than English in our state. And this is emergency life and death information. So there's certainly a lot we can do. And I mentioned earlier, administratively, how do we increase access to information? That's particularly with COVID, we've seen so many turns, how important that is, and in this context most of all.
Yes, thank you so much for that. Going back to the topic of session, I know folks continue to have questions about the voting changes, and want to make sure we have some time to cover that. Again, if you have questions, we're on the books until 7:45, so please keep getting those in and make sure we can get to as many as possible. Somebody pre-submitted this question. As I understand it, every voter who wants an absentee ballot will need to print a form for each election and submit it with a copy of ID to county elections offices. Is there no exemption for 65 plus? Is that correct? This is creating unnecessary work for both voters and elections offices. Is the state paying counties for this extra work? Senator Jackson, could you kick us off on this?
Yeah, so the first question, is the state paying elections offices for this extra work? No, absolutely not. But the actual heart of the question, I want to make sure we get really clear. So the person who pre-submitted this asked if they would be required to submit a copy, an actual copy of an ID. And I want to be clear that that is not the case. You do not have to go out and go to Kinko's. This is what Mary Margaret Oliver calls the Kinko's provision. You do not. If you have an ID that is a driver's license or an official state identification card, a real ID, the absentee ballot request form will have you put the number that, your driver's license number, it'll have you put that number in, and that will be sufficient. So you don't have to make a copy. That was something that was floated around. And so I understand why people have confusion about it, because it was talked about a lot, but that was not the end. However, if you don't have a driver's license, and if you don't have an ID, if you just have the little, the DeKalb County free voter registration card, if you just have one of the little free cards, you do have to make a copy of that. So the people, this is my, I will not stop talking about this. The people who can least afford to be able to go to Kinko's to make a copy of their ID are the ones who are actually required to do so. But you do not. Also, if you are 65 and older, you still can sign up one time for the entire cycle. So those of you who voted in the primary, if you were 65 and older and you requested an absentee ballot for the primary in May that turned to June, you automatically got any runoff ballots, you automatically got the 2020 presidential, and you automatically received the automatic for the Senate runoff, right? That still is in place. If you're 65 and older or disabled, if you're living with disabilities and you check that box, you will still automatically get them, but you do have to resubmit that paperwork every single year. We don't have a system that just keeps that on file and says, oh, this person is 65 and older. Because, it's not like you're going to be 64 the next year. We already know, right? but you have to resubmit it every year. So please know you must resubmit for the 2022 cycle or the 2021 cycle if you are, want to vote in municipal elections.
And some people would say, getting a driver's license is no problem, but I would beg to differ. My mother was a twin, and she had to locate her birth certificate. Back in her day, she was born outside of a hospital. So when we had to actually put the money up to send off for her birth certificate, and she learned in this late age that she was born 2 days different than she's always celebrated her birthday. So imagine her getting her birth certificate and having to go and change all her information because of 2 days. And she was right out of Alabama. So a number of people would probably think, oh, it's nothing. Yes, it is something, because that was something not only for her, but for her twin, who then said, well, I'm not changing anything. So just a thought.
Yeah, and I will only add to that. I share my experiences with voter ID and suppression, which are not particularly unique. When I became a citizen, which was in 2007, I tried to vote for the first time in 2008. It was in Gwinnett County. I sent in an absentee ballot application over 30 days before. And then 2 weeks later, I received a letter from our then Secretary of State, or the Secretary of State at the time, saying that I was not a citizen, that I needed to present my voter ID, including my proof of citizenship. I had those pieces of information. That did not seem at the time to me a problem, but I ended up having to fax it 4 times. And even then I didn't get confirmation that my provisional ballot that I cast counted until several weeks after. So I wouldn't have had time to fix any problems had there been a problem. I'm lucky that there wasn't, that the 4th time apparently was the charm. But as my experience, which again is not unique, shows that even when you do have the ID, this kind of law will, and even if you don't have to send in the driver's license copy, if you just write in the number, the law will still flag many people who are eligible to vote under a system, especially given the fact that this is an additional burden on the counties. As Senator Jackson pointed out, they're not getting paid to do this. In fact, one of the provisions, the law has made it harder for county boards and counties in general to get assistance, financial assistance for administration of elections. So you can imagine that if I had a hard time with it, as the law existed in 2008, these additional requirements, including the fact that the counties are not getting helped by this, that it will just flag more and more people again, even if they have the information they need to have. And finally, keep in mind, I tried to vote 30 days before. I shouldn't have had to do that. A lot of people will vote, 2 days before, or rather the week before, or they will vote in person, and they have every right to do that. It's no better or worse to do it then. It's just what is accessible to them, and they're not going to have a chance. So again, even if you have the ID or what is required under the law, many people will still be flagged. And again, particularly those of lower socioeconomic means, BIPOC voters, et cetera. So I share that story all the time, unfortunately, because it's not unique.
Absolutely. My gosh, thank you so much for sharing that. And I want to just say last call to folks for questions. If you have another question, if you'll place it in the chat, I want to make sure we get to it. For folks who pre-submitted, there were a couple people interested in housing justice and food justice. Representative Lim, I know you have a couple really interesting ideas on that, and Senator Jackson, of course, this is part of your profession. So starting with Representative Lim, what can you speak to in housing justice and food justice?
Yes, there are a great deal with food justice of food deserts, even in urban areas. So people think of food deserts sometimes in more rural areas or kind of outskirts of urban areas. I'm smack dab in the middle of, I'm in the border of ITP and OTP, and we have many, many food deserts. I mentioned the statistic of 1/4 of the people here are at or below federal poverty levels. I think there's a variety of different challenges to that that can be done now. One of the the important things around that is just the fact that we don't recognize these as deserts because we don't look at these things from a perspective of infrastructure. We've had a lot of closures of grocery stores from food depots to Publixes in my district. And people think, well, there's a grocery store right there, or there are food pantries, 5 miles away. Well, we don't have public transportation here, or great public transportation, in Gwinnett. And a lot of people don't have cars, or they're sharing with other people. So I think with food security, or insecurity rather, we need to think of it broadly based. Now, one of the pieces of legislation I introduced, which did get a hearing, was to encourage more sort of urban agriculture, something I think Senator Jackson would certainly be supportive of. It's just got a hearing. Hopefully we'll develop it next year. But I think there's a variety of different ways, because on the flip side of that, and I will relate this to housing, because I think a lot of this has to do with how we sort of zone properties. And we know that that is a problem, because there's this trend of, and I don't know if I get texts all the time from investors wanting to buy property, wanting to buy our houses. And what they're intending to do is to buy up these properties, and their direct intention isn't to gentrify, but we know that that will be the effect. So to that point, there's a variety of different things that we can do. I also introduced, this did not get a hearing because I introduced it after crossover day, a bill against exclusionary zoning, but there's also a variety of different things. Speaking of just access to information, a bill I had that did get a hearing that makes it easier to access zoning notices, one that makes it easier to access code ordinance compilations so we know what's going on. But in the more immediate term, we know that there's a housing crisis. We know that the CDC eviction moratorium cannot extend forever. Same with the FHA foreclosure moratorium. So we need to be thinking of what happens after CARES Act funding dries up, what happens after these moratoriums go away. I ended up introducing an eviction diversion program, a foreclosure diversion program. These are my thing. As Senator Jackson mentioned, I introduced 34 bills. I think we need to have these conversations about the longer term. And this is just my way of speaking out for the many people who are food or housing insecure in my area. And as all of us should be, with housing in particular, very worried about, again, what will happen after all of this funding and all of the moratoriums will dry up. So, and of course I have to say here, congratulations, because we're talking about housing, to Senator Jackson. We were so proud. Yes, March 25th was a bad day, but it was also a good day. So proud of Senator Jackson's legislation there, because the flip side of that is there are interests at work from various interest groups representing various aspects of the housing industry that would be opposed to various types of legislation. I've gotten so much pushback on just getting information about zoning to people. So I did want to emphasize that, though, if I were to close, like, that we need to think forward to what's going to happen after that bubble bursts, and we need to ensure that we are able to get information out to people about programs that exist, but also about what's going on in their neighborhood, because these changes are happening, and we won't know, if we're not paying attention, we won't know until it's too late that this entire neighborhood has been gentrified. Nobody can afford to live here.
Well, I would add that I was contacted about a mother with her small child being put out of a extended stay. And she wasn't the only one. It was a number of people, and a lot of them were being put out of their housing because they could not collect. They were not collecting on their unemployment to the COVID and to, losing their job due to no fault of their own. And we had to attack the issue of the unemployment insurance claims backlog to the point where yes, it was probably getting processed, but a number of people were not getting paid. Or if they did get paid, they were paid 1 to 3 payments, and then their payments would stop. And a number of these people, they couldn't pay their mortgage, their rent, they couldn't buy food, couldn't pay their utilities. And to start off with, we had a moratorium on cutoff of utilities and that kind of thing. But we eventually put forth several pieces of legislation to get the Georgia Department of Labor to pay in a more timely manner. And we asked the federal, as far as our federal representatives to do an investigation and an audit. But in the end, there was a Senate Bill 156 that took one of the House bills and inserted it, put them both together so that they came up with a chief labor officer to help oversee the financial statements, because we almost had a downgrade of our bond rating. And we can also find out what's happening to the claims of the people who contact us in our office. You know, where are their claims, and get information on the processing, the payments, the appeals. So hopefully this will help improve the overall oversight of that department, and we'll be able to answer people questions that contact us. And believe me, we've been inundated with questions.
Yeah. I do. I get emails every day from people wanting help with the Department of Labor. So this is just my pitch to say down ballot voting matters. Down ballot voting matters. And I'm not just talking about your state reps and your state senators. I'm talking about the Commissioner for Labor, the Commissioner for Agriculture. We talk about Georgia has the largest amount of Black farmers in the entire country concentrated in Georgia. Have they received the same type of federal funding and assistance as everybody else? No. Have they received the same level of state funding as anybody else? No. Voting down ballot matters. So those departments that we don't even necessarily know what they do, like insurance commissioner, learn about them, and let's make sure we vote all the way down the ballot, because these things really, really matter. I do want to make sure we answer Ms. Cheryl Meredith's question around SB 202. Is it set in stone? Is there anything that we can do? I know this weighs heavily on so many people's hearts. And so I'll offer a word of hope and encouragement that no, we still have hope, and that the court systems will have to deal with it. There are at least 5 different lawsuits that have been introduced: the ACLU, Fair Fight, NAACP, Common Sense. Like, I mean, you name an organization that's committed to voting, the Asians Advancing Justice, like you name them, they've sued. And so we are really dependent on the courts right now to look at various pieces of this law to determine where there's some intentionality around making sure that brown and Black folks don't have access to the ballot, to determining that this is an overwhelming burden to counties and to county elected officials to even carry this off. So that is an opportunity that we have that we're really waiting for. And then also, this is an opportunity for you to reach out. You don't really have to talk to Reverend Warnock, Reverend Senator Warnock, and John Ossoff, Senator John Ossoff, but you send them a little note and remind them that HR 1 and HR 4 are going to come their way, and they need to do their duty, which they know, which is to vote yes for those. But on the House and the federal level, House Resolution 1, House Resolution 4, which we call the John Lewis Act and the For the People's Act, those two things could really save us from a lot of the harm that we see in SB 202. And so tell them get rid of that filibuster so we can have some justice when it comes to voting, or at least carve it out so we can have some justice for voting. But no, we are not without hope. And then perhaps the last thing I want to say about this voting is that no matter what hurdles are put in our way, we can defeat them. We can overcome them. And so we just have to be prepared to go out, to knock on doors, to talk to people, to call them, to tell them the truth about how they can still access the ballot. That has been one of the biggest problems, is that there's an incredible amount of disinformation. And I don't actually think it's purposeful, but there's a lot of disinformation and misinformation about what's now legal to do and not legal to do when it comes to voting. And so now we've got time to educate folks, to let them know you can still vote absentee without an excuse. That is still available to you. Let's use that resource. You don't have an ID. Let's work together to get folks an ID. And there's some workarounds that we can work out. If we got to bring scanners to people's doors and scan in a copy of their electric bill, let's do it. We can do this. We are not without hope. This bill will not stop us. It cannot stop us. So please, please do not be discouraged. Just get ready, strap on the boots, and let's go. We got work to do, and we can do this.
Thank you, Senator. It's, despite everything, we can still end on an uplifting note, and there are things to be proud of this session. So in that spirit, I invite you each to make closing remarks as we wrap up. Representative Davis, thank you also for putting your contact information in the chat. I know there's some questions we haven't been able to get to, so please know all legislators here are accessible after tonight and can continue conversations beyond tonight. So Representative Davis, please, would you make some closing remarks?
Well, I will start off. I know that someone asked me about the city of Stonecrest. I'm not afraid to answer that in saying that for over 15 to 20 years, I have volunteered as a government watchdog. So it goes without saying that anything dealing with federal funding of taxpayers' money whatsoever would cause me concern. And you can rest assured that a separate meeting would be set up on that issue alone. That's too much to discuss right here in this limited time. But I want to thank everyone here for coming and being interested in government. A lot of people don't understand that we need you to watch out, hold us accountable, demand some form of transparency. When I say that it is your vote that hire and fire me, it is your tax money that pay me, and I am an employee of the people, I want people to clearly understand that. I want to answer to you. So once again, thank you for inviting me, Representative Kim Jackson, and I congratulate both you and Representative Lim on all the excellent work. You are two of the hardest working representatives in the General Assembly. You came in the door as though you've been there for over 10 years. So you ought to be commended. Once again, I thank you all for attending. I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you so much, Representative Davis, and thank you for being an inspiration. I remember when I first came in, you were one of the first people that was recommended that whose lead I follow. To represent Senator Jackson's point at the very beginning. One thing that I will leave people with is, we know in SB 202, one of the top things it did, there's the voter ID component, there's the limiting the runoff period, but that big piece about taking over local elections boards, I think speaks to so much and why it's important to be involved, particularly locally. And this also dovetails with Senator Jackson's point about, pay attention to what's happening down ballot, which of course pay attention to all those statewide races, but pay attention to what's happening way down ballot, because so much of the work is happening there. So much of the issues we've discussed with education and so many of the controversies around opening or reopening schools, with what we've discussed with COVID-19 and public health. And we didn't really discuss it on this call, but there was a bill to try to reform how county departments of public health were constituted. I mentioned sort of zoning earlier. You talk about housing, you can talk to your local housing agency. So much of what is happening and what we decide and what the state, those in power in the state, are trying to take over is what is happening locally. So when I said earlier too, talk to your neighbors because that's important for redistricting. Talk to them and get involved, or at least know what's going on locally with all of those agencies locally that we might not know what they're doing, but they're the ones that are really doing the work and deciding how those benefits, those grants, et cetera, are ultimately administered on site, whether people get back to which they're entitled. So that to me is also the flip side of where there is hope. Because ultimately, I think Republicans have shown this year especially that they care about local control until they don't care about it. But we should care about what's happening locally, because ultimately our conversations with our neighbors, telling them how to vote, getting them not to vote, but telling them where they can vote, telling them where the right precinct is so that their provisional ballot won't get thrown out if they have to cast one. Educating us, talking to our neighbors and talking to our local agencies, all of that shows that it's really the localities that matter. So continue to be engaged at that level, because that's what Republicans are trying to take over.
Yeah, and I'll just conclude by thanking everybody so much for being on this call, for all of your support. I will say that all of the representatives on this call, myself included, are up for re-election in 2022. That's like right now, like tomorrow. So please remember us. Go visit our websites and click to volunteer, to donate. We all need it because we do get re-elected every 2 years. And so if you've heard something today from the folks on this call that inspires you, that encourages you, then I invite you to please support us in our journey towards re-election. Again, thank you all so much. Please know you are welcome to reach out to my office and to me. We are eager to serve and to continue to serve. If you have questions, please let us know. And when it's COVID safe, I'd love to come and meet you in your neighborhoods. And let's have some conversations around the fire pit in your backyard with your neighbors. Please, we're ready to do that as soon as it's COVID safe. And so again, thank everyone. I'm so grateful for each of you. And please feel free to reach out to our office at any time. Thanks, and everybody have a great night.